The question is that grievance has been noted. I now call the honourable member for Kooyong.
Mr Deputy Speaker, you don't have to look far in our daily media cycle to find an attention-grabbing headline about the issue of food security. The Sydney Morning Herald bellows a new food crisis on our plates. The Adelaide Advertiser warns it's time to stop selling the farm. And just yesterday in my own state of Melbourne, the Sunday Age led with Qatar land grab Angus Bush on its front page. The truth is Australia is not about to starve. We produce considerably more food than we consume. We export 60% of all our agricultural produce, which has created a thriving industry worth $24.5 billion in 2009-10 alone. But these statistics don't tell us the complete story, for there are two major international developments of which we must be aware and prepared for. The first is the inexorable upward pressure on global food prices, which are ultimately leading to shortages and intrastate and interstate tensions. There are a series of complex reasons on both the demand and the supply side which has caused this trend. As a developed nation with specific expertise in food production, we have a capacity and responsibility to contribute to the global response to the food security issue. The second development relates to the deliberate policies of those countries with potential food shortages to acquire agricultural producing assets, including arable land, in developing and developed countries alike. Australia, like a number of other nations, has been the focus of increased inbound investment in its agricultural sector. Given the sensitivities involved, we do need greater transparency and scrutiny of such investments to ensure that they pass the national interest test. I will now speak in more detail about both these developments. It was in 1798 that the English scholar, the Reverend Thomas Malthus, issued his grim warning, quote, that a gigantic inevitable famine stalks in the rear as a result of the consumption demands of an ever-growing population. Fortunately, the world's population, then 800 million, went on to prosper and the prophecy came to nothing. However, the rapid growth in the world's population, now 6.9 billion and estimated to surpass 9 billion by 2050, has created and is creating significant stress on the food supply chain. Today it is estimated by the Food and Agriculture Organisation that 925 million people do not have sufficient food to eat, and with much of the population growth in Africa and Asia, where countries like Ethiopia, Niger and Uganda already suffer food security issues, existing food shortages will become more acute. The potential for spillover into domestic unrest is real, with food shortages and price hikes in the Middle East being a contributing factor to the dramatic developments we recently saw in Egypt and elsewhere. It is for this reason that Bob Zoellick, former US Deputy Secretary of State and now head of the World Bank, said food security is now a global security issue. With maize prices up 73% in the last 6 months and the Food and Agriculture Organisation's food price index just below its peak during the 2008 food crisis, Zoellick has said prices are now at dangerous levels. To understand what is happening now, it is important to recount the developments leading up to the crisis of 2008, where rice tripled in just 12 months and world grain more than doubled. At the time, the World Bank warned that up to 33 countries were unstable due to rapid price hikes that saw over 100 million people fall into poverty. On the demand side, you had a number of factors, including a more prosperous and growing population whose food preferences, particularly among the middle classes of China and India, were for higher calorie products including meat. With 1 kilogram of beef requiring 7 kilograms of feed grain, the implications for demand are obvious. So too the expansion of the biofuel industry, production tripling between 2000 and 2007, had a major impact. It was estimated by the FAO in 2007 that more than 100 million tonnes of cereals were diverted annually from food production to fuel production. Speculation by commodity investors also soared, with Alan DuPont and Mark Thirlwell pointing out in a significant article in the international journal Survival that the level of large institutional investment, the commodity index, was around 10 billion in 2000 but had risen to a whopping 250 billion in 2008. Such an explosion in demand for commodity contracts adds both to the upward price pressures and the market volatility. On the supply side, rising energy prices impacted on the cost of inputs, including fertiliser, extreme adverse weather events, droughts in Australia, Russia and the Ukraine, and floods in northern Europe, soil degradation and water scarcity were all significant factors. We're not talking about small numbers. The United Nations Environment Programme estimates that human activity has precipitated soil degradation across 2 billion hectares of vegetated land, and with estimates that up to half of the world's population will be living in areas under extreme water stress in the next 15 years, the prognosis is dire. The reality is that all these factors that we saw at play in 2008 are again on the rise. Higher energy costs, extreme weather events, water scarcity, and of course the upward trajectory of millions of people in China and India into the burgeoning middle class will only ensure when it comes to food consumption and production, demand will exceed supply. With global food production needing to double over the next 30 years, the status quo is no longer enough. That is where Australia must play a lead role. We have the institutions in place. The Australian Aid Agency, AusAid, and the Australian Centre of International Agricultural Research are cases in point. They can direct our financial support and expertise into developing countries, particularly in our region, to support sustainable production practices and programs. The adaptation of new innovative technologies and approaches is a proven path to better productivity and crop yields. We must also do all we can within the international institutional framework. This includes generating international support to bring the decade-long Doha round of free trade negotiations to a positive end. Because if we eventually see a reduction in the extensive European agricultural subsidies, we will stimulate greater production in developing countries. And we have a special opportunity as host of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, CHOGM in Western Australia, later this year to push for coordinated international action on the pressing food security issue. Most of all, this needs the attention of our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. It is a security issue as well as a humanitarian one, and only if it gets their necessary attention will we have a chance of heading off the next food crisis, which will inevitably come. In light of these international developments, it's totally predictable and understandable why a number of other countries, particularly the more wealthy ones, are sending their sovereign wealth funds in an attempt to lock up agricultural assets abroad. There are reports that the Qataris have taken control of thousands of arable hectares in Kenya. The South Koreans are in the Sudan and the Bahrainis are in Turkey. And just recently, Hassad Foods, which is owned by the Qatar government, has bought, as revealed in the Sunday Age, more than 8,000 hectares in Victoria's Western District. This follows soon after the purchase of more than 2,500 hectares of Victorian farming land the previous year. Other Australian examples abound of foreign government-owned entities entering our market. The issue is not with foreign investment per se. Foreign investment is a significant enabler for Australia. Our economy would not have developed in the way it had without the billions of dollars in foreign investment, giving our resource, manufacturing and other industries the capacity to capitalise on the opportunities available. But at the same time, Mr Deputy Speaker, we need to know more than we do about who is investing in our agricultural sector and why. The current rules around foreign investment are opaque and the national interest test is ill-defined. In the words of Patrick Colmer, the executive member of the Foreign Investment Review Board and a senior Treasury official, the way that the legislation is set up is that the default position is that the investment is allowed to proceed. What is more, the threshold for a foreign investor in Australian agricultural land is a purchase price over $231 million. Compare this to New Zealand, where the Overseas Investment Act of 2005 requires government consent before a foreign investment can proceed in a rural land acquisition exceeding 5 hectares. Indeed, when Treasury's Patrick Colmer appeared last year before my colleague Senator Bill Heffernan in his role as Chair of the Select Committee on Agriculture and Related Industries, he was asked by the Senator, you could acquire an entire district just farm by farm with a foreign entity and it would never come under your radar. The response from Colmer was, that is quite possible, yes. It is clearly inadequate to have a situation where these acquisitions can go under the radar and we find ourselves in a position that we do not have a reliable and comprehensive register of information about foreign investments in Australian agricultural assets. Labor is clearly cognisant of the growing community concern of this issue but is sitting on its hands. While the Assistant Treasurer is happy to talk the talk by posing the big questions, is land being bought up by foreign interests? Are we losing control of our food and water? He offers no serious follow-up. The Coalition, however, has moved a motion in Parliament to request the Productivity Commission gather data on foreign ownership of agricultural land and agricultural businesses. In doing so, we want to facilitate an informed, constructive, bipartisan public conversation about foreign investment in our agricultural sector, as will only become more sensitive and important. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Australian community needs to appreciate that food security is a global issue of the utmost importance. It's not merely an issue of development, but one of war and peace. What is more, those countries most acutely affected are taking preventative action to secure food supplies ahead of the next food crisis. Australia has a responsibility to help our neighbours and friends around the world who will be affected by price hikes and shortages. And at the same time, we need to do all we can to ensure that when it comes to foreign investment in our precious agricultural sector, we have greater transparency so that it can be more effectively determined whether a particular acquisition is in the national interest.
The honourable member's time has expired.